Welcome, everybody. I just found out I have less time than I thought, so we're going to do the very hot take, quick round of this. But before we get started, how many of you have community programs in your organizations? How many of you are thinking about having community or engagement programs in your organizations? Great. And how many of you feel like you need to change your organizational culture to reach your KM objectives? Okay, so I'm going to try and cover a lot of that today, talking a little bit about my own journey and what we've learned in the last 10 years of working with our clients. A decade or so ago, some of you in this room, I met at the Enterprise 2.0 conference, and we had this idea that work was going to look like this. But currently, what I've experienced is more people find that work looks like this. And a lot of these engagement and collaboration initiatives are running up into the existing power structure that's hierarchical, that's zero-sum thinking. And it's really challenging us to kind of get beyond that, or to really fundamentally change the way that our organizations operate, and with that, its culture. For many organizations, our boards of directors and senior executives have kind of realized that there's something wrong, that something needs to change. So how many of you have something along these lines in your corporate strategies? Yeah, so it's coming up. A lot of people are thinking about these things, but what does this actually mean? How do you measure any of this stuff? And more importantly, I come from an innovation background, so I've been plagued with these words that are sort of meaningless for a number of years, but people don't come to work and say, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to innovate today. I'm going to come and I'm going to engage. That's not what people come to work to do. They come to work to get work done. Sometimes they come to work to fix problems. Sometimes they come to work to answer things. So, how do you define these? And if you don't define them more specifically, how do you measure them? How do you know that you've been successful at any of them? But there's a lot of complexity behind setting up all of these things. There's different infrastructure, different people you involve, different words that you use. And so culture is this really complex adaptive system. It's a lot of things, not any one thing. And I'm kind of intrigued by complexity theory. And so it's very similar to art, which is art. You look at a piece of art and you say, that's really unique. No one could do the same art. But in the end, it's made out of simple fractals. And if you learn to do art well, you kind of learn the ratios that exist in the face. That's no different than great literature, which is made up of pretty simple words. The same is true of code. It's all made up of these simple fractals. So when we're looking at culture and this complex system that it is, what do we focus on? And I will maintain that part of the reason that we see chaos instead of simplicity here is because we're focused on the wrong things. And it's because we're drowning in the wrong data. And what I mean by that, and it's interesting talking to a KM crowd, because this morning I was thinking a lot about how we tend to get obsessed about the content, the output. And we forget that content is in service of people. So people create it, people use it, that's how you get value out of it, but the people are often ignored. And part of the reason is because the analytics that we have are mostly architected around content and transactions. So I can see that 20,000 people may have read this document, but I don't know what any one group of you did with it. That's problematic. And if I'm trying to prove value to my stakeholders, that's really problematic, because that's kind of this vanity metric. Well, what did 20,000 people do with that content. I mean, Charlie Bit My Finger was very popular on YouTube, but I'm not sure anybody did anything with it. So, you know, it really matters. And if you do look at data, you start to become, you can see things really clearly all of a sudden with it. And I use this example to illustrate this point. I've been watching my daughter with math and multiplication tables. And the way we measure success in your multiplication tables is testing. But testing can be manipulated. I can memorize that and have no idea what it means. I can cheat. There's all sorts of ways that I can get a false positive on a test. The way she's been learning to do math is she spent 3 years sorting stuff, everything. She sorted everything. By the second year, I was like, I think she's got the sorting down. By the third year, I was like, I think you could start adding addition and subtraction. I think she's got that. By the time they started adding that, her behavior was so fluid with sorting that addition, subtraction, multiplication came immediately. She ran across the word division. She's like, Mommy, what's division? I said, it's the opposite of multiplication. She started doing a division sheet. She knew exactly what that was because her conceptual understanding, her behavior of math was so good that she could get that output without being taught. So that's what I'm talking about. And I kind of use this to illustrate, which is like, if I look at the outline of all of these people, I'm focused on the differences between everybody, not the similarities. And it makes it look chaotic. But if I really focus in on the similarities, they're all exhibiting the same behavior. And all of a sudden, I can't unsee that that pattern repeats itself again and again and again. And so in a complex system, if I can find the simple fractal and influence it, I can influence the system. And so I work with a lot of community managers around a huge range, nonprofit, big Fortune 500, small commercial and startup companies. And we're starting to figure out how to break down engagement. And from that work, we created what I call the community engagement framework. And basically, it's looking at behaviors and saying, there are 4 general categories of behaviors. There's hundreds of behaviors in general, but there's 4 general categories of behaviors if you organize them by value. And we tend to measure just the first one, which is validating behaviors. I viewed that content, I liked that content, I shared that content with somebody else, or I responded to that content. That's the least valuable behavior, but it's the one that most systems can measure, so that's what we look at. The next set of behaviors is sharing. I shared something of my own with you as a gift or an act of generosity. In email, that comes off really, really poorly. Meaning, if I finish a project and send it out to 200 of my closest friends in the organization and say, hey, look, I finished this project, take a look. Nobody does that. It's antisocial. But in communities, you can share it if anybody wants to see it. It's an act of generosity rather than an act of bravado, I guess, for lack of a better word. So sharing can be a lot of things. It can be images, it can be documents, it can be ideas, many things. Once I share something and I get validation for that sharing, that is like the gateway drug for engagement, right? Because now I feel connected and I feel like I matter. And so I'm gonna share again because I shared something that somebody found useful. And from there, I may dip my toe into ask and answering. And if I get positive responses, I'm gonna start develop trust with that network of people that I'm sharing it with. And from there, I move up into, once I feel really comfortable, I'm okay asking open-ended questions, doing that innovation and collaboration that all of our executives are after. But you can't really do that in a space of people that don't trust each other. And the way I measure this is the breadth and the depth of that behavior, not how much content was shared, not how many views content is getting, but how many people are validating as a percentage of the total, and how many validations have happened. And I can measure each bunch of that month over month. And what do you think I can see from that? Yeah, but I can see how the culture is shifting, right? Can I see how much more likely people are to ask questions? Asking questions is an act of vulnerability. If I don't trust the culture, I'm not going to ask questions. Like, that's just a target on my back. Like, thank you very much. I'll just do my job. And then if I can measure culture and cultural openness and trust, I can start to measure leadership effectiveness. But that's a whole nother conversation. However, we don't develop trusting relationships with that really low-level engagement. We have to get into the more interactive, dynamic engagement. And the mistake that I see people make most is confusing a content distribution network with a community network. Content distribution is where one person posts something, lots of people get it, may respond back, but there's no relationship developing between all of those people, and there's somebody in the middle being a bottleneck. In communities, people are developing relationships with each other and developing trust in the space. And there's still boundary conditions, but the leader is not the bottleneck. Now, this has huge influence on the business model, and I'll come back to that. But the way you get engagement is by empowering people, helping them feel seen and heard like they matter. And that's very hard for leadership to do. It's much easier for peers to do, because people don't trust leaders. Meaning they know that leaders are trying to get them to do something. Of course they are. But when their peers validate them, they trust that validation and they feel seen and heard. And that is what gets them to engage. And so if you're doing a content distribution network, your business model ends up looking pretty linear. The more engagement I want, the more content I have to post. That's pretty much how that works. If you get yourself out of the middle of that network, you can get compounding value growth, because no longer are you the arbiter of what gets shared or the responses to it. And people tend to, when they're building communities, make two general mistakes. The first one is the blue line, which is they're treating it like a content network. And they post a lot of content, they invite everybody in at once, everybody consumes the content, but there's no relationship to stay for, so they go away. So now you're stuck creating more content to bring them back. The second mistake people tend to make is, oh, they'll just engage. As long as I provide a space for them, magic will happen. Magic never happens on its own. Very seldomly does magic happen on its own. And the space never gets to the inflection point because it's not invested in enough to begin with. So how does this all happen from a community management perspective? Communities kind of mature in a growth process that's not unlike small humans, right? Like you kind of move from one to the next. And as you go through these different stages, the management of the community changes quite a bit. And somebody early on asked me, well, okay, if you're failing in that first stage, how do you know that you're failing on the way to success versus failing on the way to failure? The way you do is seeing if you can get people to change the way they work, change the way they operate, get the bottleneck out of the system. Lisa, your presentation was all about getting the bottleneck out of the system, right? Like get National YMCA out of the picture so that people can connect themselves. Much more efficient. Once they do that, if you do this well, there's a big what's in it for the person who's engaging, meaning they do something faster, easier, more efficiently, they meet people they didn't, or they find information they didn't know, and that creates a pull for other people, and other people start coming in. And once you've got that pull going, you know you've created a culture that's working, and you can start growing that community a little more aggressively, because the new people coming in will acclimate to that culture, because we have mirroring neurons in our heads and we do what's expected of us in new spaces. And so if you can set that expectation up front, you can now bring other people in. And once you've got a community that's really changing the way you work, you tend to transform the business process, and the old process goes out the window because it's no longer effective. So that's my Venn diagram disappeared. There should be 2 circles here. The way you really create effective communities and the way you bound effective communities is by creating a shared purpose, a reason people are coming together, and that's not enough. People often think that's enough, and I thought that was enough for a long time. And what I realized is shared purpose isn't enough to keep the most valuable people engaged. If they're not doing something serious, if they're not working, if they're not producing something, they're gone. The only people who will stick around are people who have lots to say and little to do. And so if you're not building shared value, something tangible that is valuable to both the member and the organization, you won't sustain engagement over time. And what we found looking at our research is these complex adaptive systems that we call communities are generating some pretty phenomenal and complex objectives for the organization. So first time this year, the #1 strategic objectives that communities were able to tie their value to was culture and org change, using communities to change the behaviors of the organization. Second was quality improvement, and third was innovation. That's for internal communities. For external communities, the #1 objective was customer retention. That's also a complex goal. Lower support costs, which was #1 for years, is now second, and innovation was third. So some pretty dramatic and interesting results from this. The other thing that we've seen over the years is communities are actually becoming very cross-functional and becoming a method of how to do something versus a goal on their own. And they're really impacting functions across the organizations we work with. And what's interesting to me, too, on the right here, is all the functional groups that now have engagement and community goals in their performance goals, which tells me that communities have kind of, I guess, achieved liftoff or gotten kind of over the hump. They used to be like little initiatives that were tucked away in L&D or KM or comms, and the community managers, if there was one, sat in a closet somewhere. They're actually really impacting the whole organization today. And the way they do this is by really making a workflow more efficient and effective. And the first thing here, well, so what we do with clients is map out the current workflow and say, how do you do this today? If somebody has a question, who do they email? What do they get back? How long does that take? And then we say, okay, well, in a community, if they had a community to post to, they would get answers much more quickly and are much more likely to get the subject matter expert involved. That has some marginal value. It's incremental, though. What has real value is once that workflow and question and answer sequence is captured in a transparent place, the second person who has those sets of questions, all they have to do, if search is good, is go in and search, and they can find what they need without even asking the question. And that's where you get really big leverage from community programs across the organization. And what we've been doing the last couple of years is measuring that compounding value in the form of engagement ROI. And if you look at the little case study here, we had the opportunity to measure ROI from the very beginning of a community with an experienced community manager. And then we projected out how that value would grow over time. And then she kept actuals to projected over time. And one of the reasons we did this work is because executives don't understand knowledge management. They don't understand the value of doing something like this. So unless you can translate what you're doing into a financial measure that allows them to say, oh, this is a better option than this other option, that's what ROI is. It's a budgeting tool. It's not meant to capture all value or all cost. It's meant to show comparison against other methods. Once you can show that, you can set expectations. And one of the hardest things in community environments is they don't produce, they're compounding. So in the first year, growth is kind of slow and ROI is kind of slow. But if you can help people understand and when they can expect to see that compounding, those inflection points, then they will stick with it and actually invest in it. So lastly, I just wanted to share some of the principles I think about in community building, which is at the end, what communities are is a governance structure. That's all they are, is a way of organizing ourselves to get work done. And they're a governance structure that acts like a trellis instead of a cage. You can't tell people what to do. You can think you can tell people what to do, but they won't do what you think you just told them what to do. They'll do whatever they wanted to do anyways. So if you can give them a support structure that makes the most valuable behavior easy and rewarded, they will do that. People drive on the roads. They don't drive through forests mostly. Maybe 1%, but like most people drive on the roads when you pave them. So pave the roads that you want people to engage on. And I'm not going to go through this whole thing, but we've got this framework and a set of practices and a bunch of research around all of this that helps people understand how to build communities. Putting that all together, shared value leads to shared responsibility. I think I saw a tweet earlier today about getting people to participate in the process is the best way to get change to happen. So engage with them. Don't do things to them, do things with them. My favorite saying is control is for amateurs. Somebody then, of course, being smart, said, well, what's for professionals? And I said, well, add an S to control. Controls. Set controls and boundary conditions around what you're doing, but don't try and control people. Again, pave the roads, people will drive on the roads. We learn best and we grow and we change best when we're supported and challenged. This is very hard for a leader to do. Again, if you're creating communities, part of the joy of communities is their just-in-time support or just-in-time challenge. Whenever you need it, there's capacity there to do that from one of your peers. And it'll be a different peer at any time, but it really provides this environment that helps individuals thrive. Next, perfection is the enemy of engagement. If I give you something perfect, why should you do anything with it? Why should you give me anything? It's perfect. Or at least I know you intended it to be perfect, so if I then criticize it, that's an argument. So this is a long-held truth in the social media world, which is if you're doing blog posts, don't finish the thought. Ask your readers to finish the thought. Ask them something. Ask more questions. Be more curious. And then lastly, learn to hold strong opinions lightly. I think, especially in this divisive climate, we end up feeling like our ideas are part of our persona. And if you can kind of separate your self-worth from the ideas you have, I have so many half-assed ideas. And it's better that I view those ideas that way, because then it allows other people to come in and say, have you really thought through this? And I'm like, no, I actually haven't. So that's really useful. But playing with ideas is how you get real brainstorming to happen. So those are my thoughts, and if you'd like to engage with us, there's a variety of ways to engage, and I will step on to you. Thank you.